Welcome back to the deep dive. When we talk about major conflicts, large-scale war, the conversation often gets very clinical.
Mm-hmm. Very detached.
Yeah, exactly. We picture, like, spreadsheets, right? Tank numbers, radar maps, charts showing tons of supplies moving around.
Strategic maps, yeah, all neat red and blue lines.
Right, and it kind of reduces war to this set of almost solvable equations, quantifiable things that seem like they should predict who wins.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That reliance on objectivity, on the clean data. Well, the sources we're diving into today argue it's maybe the most dangerous illusion a military command can have.
An illusion? How so?
Because this focus on just the visible stuff, the metrics, it can breed this fatal overconfidence. It blinds leaders to what's really going on underneath, the subterranean forces at play.
Okay, so that's really our mission today, isn't it? We're trying to move past the hardware, the numbers on the page.
Yeah, beyond the statistics.
And pull out those, well, non-negotiable, intangible factors, things like, the actual will to fight, morale, discipline, trust.
The human element.
Exactly. The stuff that our sources suggest ultimately decides victory or defeat. Even if one side looks way stronger on paper, we're really analyzing the mechanics of, well, catastrophic failure.
Which brings us right to what the research calls the core paradox of conflict. It's this idea that war itself is like a state of profound psychological deception.
Deception? How?
Well, it sort of tempts both sides, doesn't it? It dangles this promise of guaranteed victory based on whatever advantage they think they have, maybe better tech, more troops, superior training.
Okay, I see. Each side is convinced they've got the winning hand.
Precisely. But the promise, it's often a mirage, because in the end, war delivers either, total victory or just absolute humiliation and defeat. And that outcome often seems disconnected from who started with the better spreadsheet, so to speak.
That binary outcome, win big or lose completely, that's the trap.
That's the trap. And the only real way out of that cycle, if you want to avoid total defeat or maybe just stop the bleeding,
it's a political solution.
Right. A treaty, a conditional surrender, an armistice. Something that stops the fighting without one side being totally crushed.
Okay, but let's say the fighting is still going on and maybe the advantages do look really skewed on paper. Why is it that sometimes these, formidable-looking armies just crumble?
Yeah, why do they fall apart?
Not because they run out of tanks or bullets necessarily, but because something inside, like the human spirit, just breaks.
We really have to unpack that deception we talked about. Commanders get tricked maybe into thinking equipment is capability.
Like having the gear is the same as being able to use it effectively.
Exactly. But the gear is only useful if the whole human system supporting it, the logistics, the morale, the command structure is actually working. When that system fails, the collapse isn't really about being outfought in a specific battle. It's more about being, internally broken. The whole structure just gives way.
Okay, let's get into that. How does that system actually break down? When you read the official reports or maybe watch news coverage, you get this sense of, dynamic movement sometimes. Arrows on maps pushing forward.
Yeah, the highlights reel.
But our sources, they paint a really different picture of modern high-intensity fighting. They describe the pace almost immediately slowing right down to a crawl, a grueling crawl. It's basically stagnation.
And that's an immediate result of just how lethal the modern battlefield is. Any advance, any movement, it's instantly spotted by, sophisticated sensors, drones, whatever.
And vulnerable to precision strikes.
Absolutely. The firepower is so saturated, so accurate, the soldiers just stop trying to advance and start digging. Survival becomes the priority.
So movement gets measured in what? Meters? Over weeks?
Sometimes, yeah.
Yeah.
Tens of meters. Survival absolutely hinges on getting into the ground, finding cover, using the earth itself for protection. Trenches, bunkers.
And this long period of just sitting there under pressure, the stagnation, it probably looks pretty insignificant on a big strategic map, right? The line barely moves for months.
Precisely. And that's the deceptive part of the crawl. A commander might look at the map and think, okay, the enemy is static, they're holding. But underneath that seemingly stable line,
something else is happening.
Immense psychological pressure is building. Logistical strain is building. Just the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of being constantly watched, constantly under threat of fire.
Yeah.
It creates the perfect conditions for a sudden catastrophic break.
So it's like a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
And then the release isn't gradual. It's the break point, that transition from the slow grind to sudden failure. What causes that? What makes it snap?
The sources are pretty clear on this. The end of the crawl isn't usually a slow, orderly retreat. It's a collapse.
A collapse. Meaning?
Meaning you see mass surrenders, large numbers of soldiers just giving up,
Hmm.
or large-scale flight units just breaking and running, or these devastating encirclements where whole units get trapped and basically neutralized all at once.
And crucially, this isn't always because they lost one specific fight.
Often not. It happens because the structure supporting the unit, their command, their supplies, their connection to the rear, suddenly just vanishes. It evaporates.
Okay, and that brings us to this danger you mentioned, encirclement and bypassing. It's not just about taking ground, it's about making the ground the enemy still holds strategically worthless.
Right. Think about the psychology of it. If you're attacked head on, okay, you fight, your training kicks in, you have a clear enemy in front of you.
Right.
But imagine the enemy achieves a major breakthrough. They drive deep into your rear area and they just go around your position, they bypass you.
Mm-hmm.
The psychological effect is totally different. You realize you haven't actually been defeated in combat.
Mm.
You've just been made irrelevant.
Wow. That sounds almost worse than being directly overrun.
In many ways it is, because it instantly shatters the chain of command. It shatters the soldier's sense of security, their sense of purpose. You could be, say, an elite unit, perfectly trained, well dug in, lots of ammo.
Ready for a fight.
Ready for a fight. But then you look over your shoulder and realize your command post, your artillery support, your main supply route, they're now 50 miles behind the enemy's advance.
You're cut off, isolated.
Completely isolated. You're not really defending anything anymore. You're just waiting to be captured or starved out. So that tactical success by the enemy to the breakthrough, it instantly becomes a strategic collapse for you because your whole reason for being there has just disappeared.
And I guess that psychological shock gets even worse when big territorial changes happen, like losing major cities that were, anchors for the defense.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Losing a large fortified city is a massive blow. It's not just about losing the buildings for cover.
It's more than that.
Much more. It's a huge logistical hub. Communication center. Medical facilities are usually concentrated there. It provides defensive depth, structure. Often there's civilian support, which can bolster morale too.
So losing it forces the defenders out, into less defensible places, maybe even open ground.
Exactly. And that shift from a complex urban environment to smaller villages or worse, open terrain, that's incredibly significant.
Why specifically? Beyond just lacking cover, I mean.
Because it strips away their defensive advantages. In a city, defenders can use the buildings, the rubble, the narrow streets to sort of negate the enemy's advantages in things like tanks or air power.
Yeah.
They can channel attacks, set ambushes.
Right. Urban warfare levels the playing field a bit.
It can, but push them out into flat, featureless open ground. They lose all that. They lose any strategic value their position had. Suddenly, they're just easy targets, easy to spot, easy to hit with artillery, easy for maneuver warfare to just sweep around them. It doesn't matter how good their training is or what gear they have at that point.
So it's like a cascading failure. The military loss forces them into a bad position, which makes the human failure, the demoralization from being bypassed, even worse.
Precisely. They go from being defenders in a fortress, feeling somewhat secure, to just being exposed targets out in the field. It ruthlessly accelerates the collapse.
Okay, so if the enemy is pulling off these big breakthroughs and encirclements, it suggests there's a weakness beyond just, fighting spirit or troop numbers at the very front.
A systemic weakness.
Yeah. And this is where, it gets really interesting. We see all these stats about military capacity lists of tanks, jets, artillery pieces, but the sources argue these numbers represent a huge blind spot.
A dangerous one.
Because they track the assets, the tangible things, but they completely ignore how vulnerable the whole logistical system is that supports those assets.
That's the core analytical mistake, isn't it? The numbers assume that all that equipment can not only get to the fight, but be kept fueled, armed, repaired, and sustained while it's there.
Which isn't guaranteed at all.
Not remotely.
Yeah.
Our sources really emphasize this. Losing some frontline gear is obviously bad, it hurts. But losing irreplaceable physical equipment,
Like
things like main battle tanks, especially modern ones, large caliber artillery systems, sophisticated electronic warfare gear, critical radar systems. Losing those cripples the military's fundamental ability to keep operating. Because you can't just quickly replace that stuff. The capacity to repair, reinforce, and replace complex systems just disappears.
Right. You can lose 100 soldiers, sadly, and maybe replace them with fresh recruits, even if they're poorly trained, but you can't just conjure up a new tank division or a high-tech radar overnight.
Especially if your own industrial base is also being hit.
Yeah. So the supply chain itself, that's the real Achilles heel.
It's the single greatest vulnerability. Think of the fighting force as the body. Logistics is the circulatory system. It keeps everything alive and functioning.
Okay.
And the thing that immediately, non-negotiably speeds up a collapse.
Yeah.
It's not just the losses at the front. It's the systematic destruction of the infrastructure behind the lines, cutting those lifelines.
So what specific infrastructure does the source material say basically guarantees failure if it gets destroyed, regardless of how many troops you still seem to have?
It's a pretty detailed list of strategic choke points.
Yeah.
The destruction has to be targeted, to get that nonlinear effect where taking out one node paralyzes a whole section. We're talking about critical junctions like major storage depots, especially for bulk fuel and ammunition. Hit those, and the clock starts ticking immediately for every unit they supply.
Yeah.
Starvation, tanks running out of gas, guns falling silent. Catastrophic for morale.
Makes sense. What else?
Railroads, especially key railway junctions and major bridges. These are vital for moving heavy equipment, bulk supplies, and large numbers of reinforcements quickly. You simply cannot sustain a modern high-intensity war effort moving everything on trucks down secondary roads, especially if those roads are also damaged or under threat.
So it cripples movement and reinforcement.
Completely.
Yeah.
The whole operational tempo just grinds to a halt. But not the defensive crawl we talked about earlier. This is an immobilizing, self-defeating crawl. You can't react or resupply effectively.
And I guess hitting the source. Arms factories.
Absolutely. Arms factories, critical repair workshops, especially those for complex systems. If you cripple the ability to produce ammunition, spare parts, or repair damaged high-tech gear, then the military is fighting with a constantly shrinking, degrading pool of resources. It just accelerates the loss of those irreplaceable assets we mentioned.
It sounds like a really vicious cycle then. Once those supply chains start getting seriously hit, the breakdown just feeds on itself. It doesn't matter how determined the commanders are.
It leads straight to downfall because it turns tactical resistance fighting hard in one spot into strategic surrender. When those essential supplies are cut, when there's no food, no fuel, and crucially no ammunition, entire divisions, even well-equipped ones from what was supposed to be the stronger force, they just get forced to surrender en masse. History is full of examples where troops, maybe even facing pretty weak opposition, just walk away or give up because they literally have nothing left to fight with.
It doesn't matter how good your rifle is if the magazine is empty and you haven't eaten in days.
Exactly. The physical reality overwhelms everything else. The collapse is incredibly rapid once those critical shortages really bite. It just proves that breaking the infrastructure inevitably leads to the rapid breakdown of human will.
And we should probably loop back here to the idea of manpower itself being a kind of infrastructure. We focus on concrete and steel, but troop strength isn't infinite either. It can be stretched too thin.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dwindling manpower makes the strain from infrastructure loss so much worse. If you're taking heavy casualties and your supply lines are cut, you're forced into impossible choices.
Like what?
Well, maybe you pull units from guarding the rear areas, leaving your remaining logistics hubs vulnerable. Or you have to abandon strategically important towns or defensive lines simply because you don't have enough bodies to hold them.
Which leaves the units still fighting even more exposed and overwhelmed.
Right. It's not just about the total number of soldiers. It's about operational tempo and having enough people to cover the required ground. If you're supposed to defend, say, a 100-kilometer front, but you only have a skeleton crew because all your reinforcements are stuck 50 miles back thanks to a blown bridge.
That front line becomes incredibly porous.
Exactly. The enemy sees the gaps, pushes through, and achieves those breakthroughs and encirclements we talked about. It's the human logistics failing because the physical logistics failed first.
And the troops who are left, they can't be rotated out. No rest.
Often no. Which means the soldiers who remain just get ground down. They reach physical and mental exhaustion much faster, making them incapable of fighting effectively, no matter how much equipment they might technically still have according to the spreadsheets.
Okay, so we've got this picture of, immense psychological strain from the slow crawl and the shock of encirclement, combined with the physical strain of logistics breaking down, supplies drying up.
The system fraying.
Right. Now, let's introduce another factor, something that seems to weaponize both of those vulnerabilities. The drone. Our sources talk about this relentless, constant presence, an unseen enemy that fundamentally changes the feeling of safety on the battlefield.
It's described as the ultimate psychological disruptor. Because drones deliver two things incredibly effectively. One is precise destruction, obviously, but the other, maybe even more important, is pervasive, constant fear.
How is it different from, say, artillery fear?
Well, historically, warfare had zones of danger, right? There was the immediate front line, maybe an artillery impact zone behind that. But once you got further back, behind the lines,
You had some safety, a
Yeah.
chance to relax.
a degree of safety, yeah.
Yeah.
You could eat, maybe sleep, coordinate, without feeling like you were immediately about to be hit. Drones, especially persistent surveillance drones, combined with loitering munitions or quick artillery calls, they erase that safe zone,
Completely.
pretty much. Unlike, say, traditional artillery where you might hear the whistle or know it's targeting a certain area, or an infantry attack you can see coming and take shelter from. Drones can strike with pinpoint accuracy, often without warning, almost anywhere, anytime.
It's just that constant potential threat.
Yeah, that ability to watch continuously and then strike instantly.
Yeah.
It creates this persistent, gnawing sense of dread among the troops. You are never truly safe, and if you're never truly safe, you can never truly rest.
Wow, that constant low-level hum of anxiety. It must just wreck people psychologically, amplifying all the other chaos we've talked about, the encirclements, the shortages.
It absolutely erodes morale, and it disrupts basic operations.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to get orders or fix a vehicle, or even just gather for a quick meal.
Knowing a drone could be watching.
Knowing something could be watching, ready to drop something precisely on you, or call in artillery instantly. This inability to ever relax, to find even temporary sanctuary, it just grinds down a soldier's ability to maintain focus, discipline, basic functioning.
It sounds like a state of perpetual vigilance.
Exactly, which leads very quickly to mental exhaustion. It makes troops who are already struggling, hungry, tired, cut off, feel even more vulnerable, more hopeless.
The sources seem to really emphasize the continuous nature of this drone threat as being key.
Yeah, that continuity is fascinating and terrifying. Think about World War I trenches. Heavy artillery bombardment was horrific, right?
Absolutely.
But you often knew when it was likely before an attack, and you could go deep into bunkers when the barrage started. There were periods where the immediate threat ceased, allowing some recovery.
Okay.
The modern drone environment, particularly with cheap, ubiquitous surveillance drones, means the threat doesn't cease. Even when soldiers are dug in or supposedly safe behind the lines, they feel watched. They know they can be struck.
So even simple acts become dangerous. Making coffee, using a radio.
Potentially, yes. Every heat signature, every electronic emission, every small gathering could be an invitation for a strike. It changes the whole dynamic of daily life in a war zone.
And if a soldier is already dealing with, like you said, hunger, no sleep because they can't be rotated out, the shock of seeing their unit bypassed, that constant vulnerability from the air.
It becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back. It denies that fundamental human need for safety, not just physical safety, but psychological safety. The chance to just drop your guard for a moment and mentally recover.
Or you can't recover.
The force structure breaks down exponentially faster. A soldier might maybe tolerate being hungry for a while if they think help is coming, but tolerating that constant existential dread of being hunted 247 even in your supposed shelter, that's different.
So the drone threat really accelerates that human failure.
It's a key accelerant, yeah, because it ensures the human factor collapses, potentially even before the physical resources are totally gone. The will breaks before the body does, almost.
Okay, so we have this grim backdrop. Logistics are failing. Soldiers are exhausted. They feel constantly hunted by drones. Maybe their unit's been cut off.
A pretty bleak picture.
Yeah, and naturally, leadership tries to counter this, right? They roll out the propaganda, try to spin the narrative, boost morale, project strength, victory is near, that sort of thing.
Standard playbook.
But our source material suggests that once that physical and psychological breakdown really starts, that propaganda lie becomes completely ineffective.
It's actually worse than ineffective. It becomes a negative multiplier. It actively harms morale.
How so?
Well, propaganda is designed to sell this idea of, inevitable victory, our side's overwhelming strength, the enemy's weakness.
Right, the official story.
But when the soldier on the ground is facing the grim reality, they're cold, they're hungry, they're seeing their buddies killed by drones, they know their whole division is surrounded. That official story creates this massive gap, cognitive dissonance.
The reality they're living completely clashes with the narrative they're being told.
Exactly. And that gap, that dissonance, it doesn't inspire them. It breeds distrust, resentment. It makes them feel like the leadership is either lying to them or is completely clueless. Either way, trust evaporates.
What are the specific things that make those grandiose claims ring hollow so quickly?
Well, it's all the things we've just been talking about. The soldier is experiencing acute hunger because the supply depots they were promised were full got blown up.
Okay.
They've just seen a major city fall, meaning now they're stuck defending a ditch in the middle of nowhere. They're dealing with the constant, grinding fear of drone strikes, which the official news might be ignoring or downplaying.
So when the radio says, everything's fine, supply line secure, glorious victory achieved yesterday.
And their stomach is empty, they haven't seen an ammo resupply in 3 days, and they just watch their neighboring unit get wiped out, the leadership instantly loses all credibility.
So the faster morale collapses is basically linked to how big the gap is between the propaganda and the truth they see with their own eyes.
Absolutely. If the command structure just keeps insisting everything's going according to plan, denying huge losses of irreplaceable tanks, ignoring the encirclements, pretending the drone threat isn't real or that supplies are getting through when they clearly aren't.
Faith just vanishes.
Completely. And those false narratives, instead of making soldiers fight harder, actually accelerate desertion and mass surrender. Because the soldier's motivation shifts. It's no longer about achieving the mission, it's about surviving the perceived incompetence or dishonesty of their own command.
Okay, so propaganda fails. What about the other approach? Not the carrot, but the stick. Coercion.
Yes. Threats, punishments, rigid discipline, barrier troops, even summary executions for deserters.
Does that work to keep soldiers fighting when things get bad?
The sources suggest it's a very temporary measure, and it only really functions if the basic logistical and strategic backbone of the army is still mostly intact.
Why only then?
Because coercion relies on the threat of punishment being more immediate and more terrifying than the threat of dying in battle or from deprivation.
Right.
But once the logistics completely fail, once starvation and utter despair take hold, especially if your unit's been bypassed and abandoned, that calculation flips.
How does it flip? Why doesn't the fear of being shot by your own side keep you in the trench?
Because harsh measures don't magically create food. They don't rebuild bombed bridges. They certainly don't shoot down the drones that are hunting you.
Right.
All coercion does at that point is confirm to the soldier that their command views them as completely expendable cannon fodder. It reinforces that feeling of betrayal that the lies already started.
So it actually makes things worse, hastens the collapse.
It often does, yes. When the enemy is breaking through, when your position is hopeless, when you're starving, the threat of dying from hunger or a drone strike right now feels much more real and inevitable than the possibility of maybe being caught and shot by a military policeman later.
So the basic human drive for self-preservation overrides even the most brutal discipline.
It seems to. When desperation becomes total, even the enforcers, the military police, the hardline political officers, whoever they start to lose their own will. They're suffering the same shortages, the same fear, the same psychological collapse.
They're human too.
Exactly. Coercion is only as strong as the system implementing it. When that system is starved of resources and hope, the enforcers themselves become ineffective. And the whole structure just dissolves into chaos. Mass desertion, surrender. The gap between the command's demands and the soldier's reality has become too wide to bridge with threats.
We've sort of dissected this process of collapse, haven't we? From the front lines grinding to a halt, to the supply lines being cut, the psychological impact of drones, the failure of propaganda and coercion.
Yeah, we've traced the breakdown through the system.
And it really brings us back to that core theme we started with. Wars are ultimately fought by people, not by machines, not by statistics.
People, yeah.
And ignoring their basic human needs.
Well, it seems fatal. Even if you have the most powerful army on paper, that really is the ultimate non-negotiable lesson coming out of these sources.
Yeah.
You can have the fanciest satellite tech, the most advanced tanks, but if you ignore the foundational needs of the humans operating them,
All the training, all the discipline, it just reaches a breaking point.
it does, and quickly.
So what are those specific foundational needs, the things that absolutely must be met to keep a force fighting, even if they're, currently losing ground or under immense pressure?
The sources are quite meticulous about this. And it's often the basics, the things maybe easily forgotten when strategic pressure mounts. Things like
Okay.
rest, actual rest, timely rotations or replacements. Soldiers cannot function effectively if they are perpetually engaged, perpetually exhausted. They need to be pulled back to recover, mentally and physically.
Makes sense. What else?
The absolute basics: food, water, proper clothing for the conditions. These aren't just nice-to-haves or morale boosters. They're operational necessities. A soldier who is malnourished, dehydrated, or freezing simply cannot operate complex equipment effectively, follow difficult orders, or maintain alertness.
Their body literally starts shutting down.
Right. And then essential medical care. Knowing that if you get wounded, there's a system in place to try and evacuate you and treat you. That's incredibly powerful for morale.
And the opposite, if casualties are just left.
If soldiers see their wounded comrades being abandoned or receiving no care, the willingness of the next soldier to risk getting wounded plummets dramatically. Why fight hard if getting hit means a slow, agonizing death in a ditch?
So, underlying all this is hope, isn't it? A soldier's resolve seems fueled by some kind of hope of victory maybe, or at least hope that their sacrifice isn't pointless.
That's the crucial psychological trigger, yes. No soldier, whatever their ideology or how tough their training, signs up intending to die completely in vain. They need to believe their effort matters, that there's a purpose.
But that hope can fade pretty quickly under the conditions we've described.
Oh, absolutely. When that human factor is systematically ignored, when soldiers find themselves stranded by encirclement because of what looks like command incompetence, when they're left exposed in open ground because the logistics failed to hold a fortified city, when they feel defenseless because the ammo ran out or critical support systems were destroyed, when they're under that constant, terrifying drone surveillance,
the fight stops feeling like a mission.
it stops feeling like a mission and starts feeling like a death sentence, a pointless one.
And once it feels like a death sentence, the rational choice becomes self-preservation, surrender.
Exactly. The human being, even under duress, is often quite rational in the face of truly impossible odds. The collapse happens when the soldier calculates, maybe subconsciously, that their greatest immediate threat isn't actually the enemy soldier over there. It's their own side's failure to support them, their command's willingness to let them die pointlessly from hunger or exposure or a drone strike.
So if we flip this around, what's the recipe for endurance? If we connect all this to the bigger picture, what is the true measure of a military's strength? Its ability to actually weather these storms of failure and keep fighting?
It seems to be its ability to sustain the spirit of its soldiers, primarily by maintaining trust, even when things are going badly, even amidst catastrophic physical losses, tanks destroyed, territory lost.
Trust is key.
Trust seems paramount. The collapse of strongholds, the destruction of bridges, the terror of drones. These things can be endured, the sources suggest, but only if the soldiers believe two things. One, that their leadership is being honest with them about the situation, however grim.
No more propaganda lies.
Right. And two, crucially, that the leadership is actively, demonstrably trying to ensure their survival and operational viability, that they're making real efforts to provide those basic human necessities, food, ammo, medical care, rotation.
So a force that can still manage to meet those basic needs and maintain that trust even while losing on the map.
That's the force that can endure the deception of war, as the paradox puts it. That's the force that can survive to fight another day or hold out until the situation changes. It transforms just basic physical existence into actual operational resilience. The spirit remains intact, even if the body is battered. Hashtag outro.
So, okay, pulling all this together, what does it all mean? Especially for those people looking at the spreadsheets, counting the tanks and planes.
Yeah, what's the takeaway?
Well, the key lesson from this deep dive seems pretty clear. Real military success requires this delicate balance. You need the grand strategy, sure, but you absolutely have to balance it with basic human compassion. And you have to maintain trust, absolute trust, through honest leadership that acknowledges reality even when the news is bad. Because ignoring the soldiers' empty stomach or their need for rest or their fear, that seems far more destructive in the long run than losing an entire tank battalion.
I think that sums it up well. The ultimate strength of a military force doesn't matter how fancy its weapons are or how many troops it started with. It's ultimately defined by its ability to keep its logistics functioning and meet the basic physical and psychological needs of its soldiers.
And the failure to do that.
The failure to do that, especially when amplified by things like the constant fear from drones and the systematic destruction of infrastructure, it just turns any initial advantage, numerical or technological, into potentially catastrophic mass surrender. The material failure triggers the human failure, and then that human failure just spirals downwards.
Which leaves us with a really important question, something for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. If the real bedrock of military endurance is trust, honesty, and meeting those basic human needs, could a force that starts out weaker, maybe fewer resources, less advanced technology, could they potentially win or at least endure by strategically prioritizing that human spirit above everything else?
Assuming they survive the initial onslaught, you mean?
Yeah, assuming they can weather the first storm. Could focusing intensely on internal coherence, on trust, on just basic human needs, could that become the ultimate strategic weapon against a larger, maybe more technologically advanced, but ultimately more brittle opponent? Could the human factor be the decisive factor?